Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the couple of people who are watching to start for tonight's live stream from CVDPA, which is the AOCVA, the Australian Operational Colour Vision Assessment is here. What next? So tonight, really happy to be able to introduce and have with us John and Clinton, who are both CVDPA directors, and also a special guest, Luke. Luke being the first candidate to sit the AOCVA, and not only sit it, but successfully pass it yesterday up at Wellcamp Airport. So firstly, Luke, massive congratulations for that. Great news, great outcome.
Thanks so much.
Well done, Luke.
Yeah, and great to have you with us tonight as well. So really we'll split tonight into a couple of parts. So firstly, the title of today's session is the AOCVA is here. What next? So we'll start by introducing John. John was involved with the technical working group within CASA as well around designing and implementing the AOCVA, and now we've seen the legislative instrument that gives it power. So I'll start with John. John, might ask you to take us through where we are and what this means and what's happening, and then we'll talk to Luke about his experience as a candidate and what it was like, and get him to run us through Go to Woe, the AOCVA and his experience sitting that with a CASA representative. But if everyone's happy with that, then John, over to you.
Yeah, it sounds good. And thanks, Michael. And thanks for everyone tuning in tonight. Good to have you here. And it's good to finally have this assessment up and running after over a 2.5 year pause, I suppose now it's been. Well done, Luke, on yesterday. So as Michael mentioned, it was a fairly lengthy process, but the last 6 months or so, as we sort of led to the finalisation of the assessment, I feel it's been fairly positive overall. The technical working group, it was made up of people both from within CASA as well as from industry as well, including several flight examiners. And we all had some input into the design and the overall makeup of what we see today as the final assessment. So I probably won't bore you too much with the actual legislative instrument that is available on the CASA website for anyone who's sort of keen to go through and have a look at that. But what I was going to point out for people who haven't actually seen it yet is on the CASA website. There's now a lot of information and documentation about this new process and how we go about doing the test. So I'm just going to share the screen now. Hopefully everyone can see that at home. So this is on the CASA website. If you basically just do a search for colour vision assessment, you're going to come up with a page like this. And essentially it just gives you an overview of the 3 tiers of testing, which straight out of the CASRs, 67.150 for a class 1. And just like we've always had, the step 1 test is the Ishihara test, the second tier test being the Farnsworth Lantern. They also mentioned the Optec 900. And the third tier, which is the test which we've been discussing now for a long time, is the one which is supposed to simulate an operational situation. So as you can see, we've now landed with the Australian Operational Colour Vision Assessment. The CAD test is still in there, and I guess that's a discussion and maybe a debate for another day, but the important aspect of this is that we do have an operational test available to us again. For those who remember some of the history of this, you'll recall that the previous test was referred to as the OCVA. This new test that's been designed has been rebranded the Australian Operational Colour Vision Test, because there is a few minor differences in how it's conducted now and some of the assessment items that are included. So again, I won't read through all this word for word, but basically you can have a look for yourself at home. It describes each of the tests in a little bit of detail there. And if you scroll down to the tier 3 testing regime with the AOCVA, we can see that it talks about 3 components to the test, being the ground component. There's a general flight component, and there's also a flight component which specifically focuses on the PAPI. And I'm sure Luke will talk a little bit more to that later on this evening. Scrolling further down, it talks about eligibility requirements for the test. There's some stuff there about air traffic controllers and their colour vision requirements. And the part I really wanted to point out is all this documentation that is now available. You can see here. And in particular, the ones that I'd encourage people at home to have a look at would be the Flight Examiner Handbook, Appendix A. What that document does is it details in a standardised manner how flight examiners should be conducting this test and exactly what items they're going to be looking for and assessing you on. So although it is a document for flight examiners, it's also useful as a candidate to have a read through that as well prior to undertaking a test, so that obviously you know exactly what you're going to be tested on. There's a copy of the actual test form available there too. So in fact, if I just bring these up on the screen briefly, just stand by one. So firstly, this is just having a look at the Flight Examiner Handbook. So hopefully everyone can see that okay now. It's fairly long, it's about 16 pages in length there, but as you can see, it's quite detailed. It goes through the requirements for examiners who are going to be approved to conduct the test. And one of the things that examiners have to do prior to being authorised by CASA to do this test is complete a training module. And once they've done that, they'll then be ultimately authorised. CASA is still working through that at the moment. Essentially, as far as I'm aware, the training module in the package has been put together. Obviously, yesterday, Luke was the very first candidate to undertake the test, and he actually did it with a CASA flight training examiner. So that test, I guess, was utilised as an opportunity just to do a final review from an internal CASA perspective to make sure they were happy with everything and how the test was conducted. And now the next phase over the coming weeks is going to be to get other industry examiners trained and approved across the country.
John, if I stop you, John, I might just stop you there quickly while we're talking about the Flight Examiner's Handbook. You've called out that it is available on the CASA website, but really there should be no surprises for anyone who wants to sit the AOCVA, and this should be something they really go through, because it details how examiners should be assessing them. Is that a fair statement?
Exactly right, yeah. So although it's an examiner handbook, it's really also useful for candidates as well. So as you can see, it details the requirements for both the examiner as well as the applicant who is undertaking the test. Importantly too, some people at home might be asking, what experience requirements do I need prior to being able to do this test? And the examiner handbook here specifically says that you're not required to hold a pilot license. So for those that are maybe looking at entering the industry that don't have any experience yet, you are certainly able to go and undertake this assessment. Having said that though, certainly myself, and I'm sure anyone who's done this test or a similar test in the past, we would recommend that you do have at least some basic exposure to the operational environment. And again, Luke will probably talk to that a little bit more later, given his experience yesterday. Essentially, if you're not sure, we'd encourage you to either speak to the CVDPA, speak to even CASA, and of course, speak to the flight examiner that you're looking to utilise to undertake the test. There is a requirement in there currently that applicants must hold a medical certificate, having already undertaken and failed either the Tier 1 or Tier 2 tests, being the Ishihara and Farnsworth. And then once you've failed those two tests, you're then eligible to undertake the third tier test. I should point out too, we have just recently discovered there's a few typos in this document. CASA have been made aware of some of these ones, and they will be corrected in the future revision. So if anyone does come across anything you're not sure of, or that maybe doesn't sound quite right, feel free to shoot us an email at CVDPA, and we can certainly pass that feedback on as well. Again, I'm not going to go through this document word for word, but essentially I just wanted to point out how detailed it is. It goes through all of the flight component. You can see we've got the ground component, the flight component general, and the PAPI component, and all of the assessment items which are looked at as part of that test. Again, it talks about assessment scope and conditions and the methodology that the examiner uses. There is both a daytime and a nighttime component to the tests, which is similar to the previous AOCVA that we used to have in Australia. It gives you some examples of things that might constitute a fail assessment on a test. So, for example, failure to identify significant features on an aeronautical chart. Maybe if you can't interpret aircraft instruments correctly, for example. So they're just sort of some of the things that examiners will be looking at. Administrative requirements, that's more so for the examiner. And then as we scroll on, there's some further discussion here on the actual assessment component. So it talks about, for example, the ground component, looking at aeronautical charts and what's being assessed as part of that. One thing I should emphasise too is that this test is not a colour naming exercise. It's essentially a test to make sure that you can correctly interpret the information that's presented to you. So the examiner is not going to sit there asking you to name all the colours on these charts. He's going to be checking that you can interpret airspace boundaries, maybe high terrain contours, radio frequencies, things like that. Similarly, when you get out to the aircraft and we're looking for interpretation of flight instruments and displays, once again, it's not a colour naming exercise. The examiner is going to be looking to make sure that you can correctly interpret information on various instruments, and there's some examples here.
Yeah, and to that point as well, John, I think I'm happy to share my own example from my own OCVA, which I did in New Zealand, which is, and we just saw the airspeed indicator example there. I think this speaks to the point of having some aeronautical experience, and particularly experience in the aeroplane you're going to be sitting your practical test in, even if that's just sitting in it on the ramp for a couple of hours, or making sure you can look at the GPS screen and knowing what the different settings are and what the different terrain features are, for instance. But yeah. I know I can speak for mine with the airspeed. It was show me where what speed I can't extend the flaps beyond. Tell me at which point it becomes danger. Tell me which the V&E is. So there's a little bit of aeronautical knowledge, which it's really important to have. And I can't speak highly enough for you actually sitting in the aeroplane.
Yeah, absolutely. So then you go out to the aircraft, and obviously it's looking at external features now, things like runway holding point lines and markings. So making sure you know when you're allowed to enter a runway, I guess. Then you'll take off, and one of the items on here is emergency landing fields. So, being able to identify differences in terrain features, so that, for example, if you had an engine failure, you can pick out somewhere that is safe to land. Obviously, there's the nighttime component I mentioned as well. So at night, obviously, the examiner's again going to be looking for significant aeronautical lights, like holding point stop bar lights, for example, maybe obstruction lights on towers, and obviously the runway environment lights itself. And then the other component of the test we mentioned specifically, and this is really the major difference between the OCVA and the AOCVA. CASA wanted to have a lot more emphasis on the PAPI. So there is actually a specific PAPI component now, where the candidate's required to identify changing signals across various runs that are undertaken. So again, the examiner handbook describes all of this, but run 1, for example, is essentially a practice run. It's used for the examiner and the candidate to make sure they're both seeing the same thing. And if there's any confusion at all, then that obviously would need to get resolved prior to continuing further with the test. But essentially, the aircraft is positioned on around about a 6-mile final at 1,500 feet. And then basically you continue flying towards the runway until approximately 3 miles, and then the examiner will break off the approach. And obviously maintaining a constant altitude at 1,500 feet, you're going to see a transition in the PAPI lights as it transitions from on slope to gradually becoming high. So run 1 is used as a practice run. And then the second run, the examiner will position the airplane at exactly the same point again, at 6 miles and 1,500 feet, and fly towards the runway, maintaining that constant altitude. And as you can see here, the applicant is required to call out when the aircraft is on slope, being 2 reds and 2 white lights, to what's happening as the signal is changing and as you gradually become high. So again, we break off that run by 3 miles, and then we go again for a third run. This one's positioned at the same distance at 6 miles, but at a slightly lower altitude at 1,200 feet. So obviously at 1,200 feet, you're now going to be starting the approach slightly low. So in that case, you're likely to see 4 red lights. And as you fly towards the runway, you're going to see the PAPI lights changing and transitioning from red to ultimately 2 reds and 2 whites. And then you can see finally run 4 is a repeat of run 2, and then run 5 is a repeat of run 3. So, I mean, in some ways it might be considered a bit of an overkill potentially, but that's essentially what we're looking for here in this test and what CASA wanted to see. And that's basically it. So there's the ground component, the flight component with all the general items, and then the PAPI component. And for candidates who pass all of those items, they're granted an unrestricted medical. And that's basically that. So I've probably spoke for a little bit too long now. So I think maybe probably the best person to listen to is maybe Luke, and he can share maybe some of his experience on how it was conducted yesterday.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you for having me, everybody. So a bit of a background with myself. I've always wanted to be a pilot since day one. I can't describe it, just everything I wanted to do. Growing up, I did know I did have colour vision deficiency just through like tests you do at school or the optometrist every year. So I knew becoming a pilot would be challenging. However, I was able to successfully get a Class 1 medical and hold, I think, 3 or 4 renewals. Funnily enough, I actually lost my medical, which is a bit weird for someone who's colour vision deficient. Usually you just don't get it in the first place. But I'll come back to that. So a bit of flying background. I was in the Air Force Cadets. I think that was an absolutely fantastic way to start flying. I did gliding, which is just, there is no better way to start flying. That is just the best. I did that through high school. Coming out of high school, I tried for Rex, the cadetship. I was unsuccessful with that. However, I did get into the Qantas Group Pilot Academy. Already did my training, which was an amazing year. I couldn't recommend it high enough. That was actually when I lost my medical. So leading back into what happened, I lost the medical with the DAMI in Toowoomba, which then led on to doing the Farnsworth Lantern test. Farnsworth Lantern test is very old and it should be gone, to be honest. You have to identify 3 different colors. However, the white looks like a yellow, and the yellow and the green look so similar. I couldn't like differentiate really much at all, which then led on to a few months later doing the CAD test in Melbourne. The CAD test is also quite challenging. It basically looks like a TV static if anyone hasn't seen it, and there will be colors going in a diagonal direction, and you have to basically point out, does it land at the top left, bottom right, top right? Then as it changes colors, it brings up a massive report at the end of what deficient you are. So I'm a Dutch note, which is green deficiency. Yes, so this is exactly what it looks like. Oh.
This is exactly what it looks like if it works. There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Simulating an operational situation, as we can see.
Yeah, so as you can see, for those who might not be able to see it, in fact, as well, it is quite challenging. And then the person I went to in Melbourne also looked at other colour vision tests that really can produce a solid report on what I am, which I found, as I said, I'm a Dutch note, which is green deficient. From there, this is probably like the dark days, as we could probably say, when there wasn't really much announcements going on until October last year, when CASA got publicly basically named and shamed by David Fawcett, the senator. He's a great guy. So yes, from there, I was getting in touch with John and Simon quite a bit, who's not here at the moment, but who will be, just about what's next. And basically, I was just waiting for the colour vision test to come out. On top of that, obviously, we have a pathway with the Qantas Group Pilot Academy I couldn't really pursue because I don't have a medical, so that also held me back. But yeah, once the obviously colour vision, so the AOCVA got announced, sorry, it was fantastic. I got into a lady in CASA who really, really helped me out. She was just fantastic. She was very much supportive of what was going on, and she had quite a bit of empathy for pilots as she worked in the airline industry before. So it's just a bit of a waiting game. Obviously, it was a little bit delayed of what they initially thought, but eventually I was booked into the test. Moving on to the test, it was actually a great day. I was quite frankly crapping myself about the day, as you would imagine. It is sliding door moments if it doesn't work out. But the gentleman I had from CASA, he was fantastic. He was extremely patient. Obviously, he is CASA, so his briefs are very professional and a little bit overwhelming. But I did the test at Toowoomba West Wellcamp Airport. That's what I did my flight training, so I knew they had a good PAPI. And before getting into the test, I should say that I did do a practice flight. So I did go up with an instructor just to make sure I could see the lights. Because at the end of the day, even though you don't need to name colors for the PAPI, you obviously still need to identify it. And there is PAPIs out there that are old and not looked after that you need to have a look at before you sit your test. So even if you just want to call up the ARO who looks after that sort of stuff at an airport, just ask, like, do you have LED lights? Do you have, really very bright PAPI lights before even going up for a test flight, so you don't waste your money. You'll find that obviously people are very supportive of this who aren't colour vision deficient, like instructors, that they'd be willing to help you out. So I did my practice at Wellcamp. I was fairly happy with what I could see. I also did have a look at Toowoomba City's aerodrome, just in case I was going there, and that was okay as well. So moving on with the test on Wednesday. Yeah, as I said, I was quite nervous. Had a very in-depth briefing about what I could expect throughout the day. The ground component was actually some of those images that you saw before, as John said, naming airspace, boundaries, frequencies, lower safe altitudes, which are written on some maps. Also looking at a different map that shows you where you can pick up radio coverage. So just never got asked, what is this color or anything. Basically just information on the map. Can you see the boundary of airspace, like I said before? That was straightforward. Obviously, I do have 270 hours, which is not much compared to other people out there, but it's still a considerable amount with flight training done. So even though I lost my medical, I did complete my commercial pilot license and multi-engine instrument rating, so I had an idea of what all maps and lights look like. So yeah, moving on, it was scheduled to be half an hour, the ground component. It took me 30 minutes. Like, it was very straightforward. Nothing was complicated. As Michael said, you were naming stuff on like an airspeed indicator, like what speed can you put the flap out, and you just look at the wide arc and just say, okay, it's 85 knots. Where's V&E? Or that's basically the fastest the airplane can go, for those who don't know. It's basically where the, a red line is. For those who wouldn't be able to see red, you'll just see where the coloring stops. It was nothing complicated at all, so don't worry about that. Moving on to the flying, this is obviously the big one. I did a little bit of flying, but as the flight instructor handbook says, you don't have to fly at all if you don't want to. This is not a flying test. And the CASA examiner, who I had, emphasized that. He says, I'm not judging any flying. I don't care if you don't fly at all, which was great. So I got into the airplane, all was well. I'm kind of a person who freaks out a bit before, but as soon as I'm in the hot seat, I just go into this new mental state where I just calm down and just thought, let's get it done, sort of thing. Got airborne out of Toowoomba, or Wellcamp, I should say. As John said, took off, went to the south of the aerodrome, pointed out a field of where would you land, sort of thing. And what actually happened for me is, because surrounding the airport, there are a lot of paddocks with a lot of fences. The best thing was a road to land at, and he was happy with that. And then I just followed on to say, because the Diamond Air 40, which I did it on, has a good glide range, we could make it to a field about 2 miles away because of its glide range. He was happy with that as well. After that, it was basically straight into the PAPI runs, and this is where it got interesting. So obviously in winter in Australia, the sun's right in the north. So we came to do runway 30, which is basically almost north. and the sun was actually too bright to view the PAPI on 3.0. So this is why there's practice run is there to identify issues like this that could potentially happen. He was seeing the same thing I was seeing. It was visible to see the PAPI, however, just the sun was just that bright in the sky. We actually broke off and tracked above the field to basically go against traffic and do it on the other runway. That was okay because you break off at 3 miles, and we ended up doing another practice run, which was great because we needed to see the PAPI on that side. And small stuff like Camp has a PAPI on either side of the runway, just because it's Cathay 74 lands there, so they need that. But they actually change at different rates. So we discussed that. Let's look at the left one. Let's look at the right one. He was completely fine with that. We ended up doing that and did the runs. Once again, the sun was that bright. It actually did make it difficult to see the PAPI. However, we were seeing the exact same thing. So what I was describing, he could see the exact same thing. So he was more than happy. And we actually discussed after every run if we could see similar things, and we said yes, because once the test is going, they are not allowed to mention anything. And in the briefing that I did get, Slav, the guy that's from CASA, mentioned that if I'm not saying anything, everything is going well. If I say let's go home, the test is done. So he didn't say anything. So every run was relieving, even though there's only 4 runs. It's a long, about 10 minutes. Once that was all done, that's basically it for the day component. Came back in, landed back at World Camp, had a bit of a break, and then started briefing for the nighttime. Nighttime is really straightforward, actually. You're just identifying other aircraft, which direction they're going in. A lot of the runway and taxi lights and airport surrounding lights, once again, you don't have to name colors, you just have to describe what you can see. I personally used what color they were, and we discussed that, and he was happy with that. But for anyone who's not confident with the color, you don't have to mention anything. So got airborne again. We just basically did 4 circuits. I was asked to describe the PAPI, which is not asked for in the application form. However, if you can see it in the day, you should be able to see it at night. And if you are asked to see the PAPI, you can speak up and say, listen, this isn't part of it. But I was more than happy to comply with the question. I could see it. And to be honest, that was really about it. It was just the same thing 3 or 4 times. Can you see where the taxiways are? Can you see the runway center line? A lot of airports don't have a runway center line light. So basically we had the landing lights on, got into a flare almost, and basically that's when you can see where the runway center line is, where the white lines are. Went around and did that a few times, and yeah, that was it. Once again, don't have to name any colors. I did, but that was it. And he shook my hand. He said, I have nothing to debrief about, and that was it. Big relief.
Oh, it's fantastic. Look, I can't think of, in fact, I can't think of any of my flight tests where the examiners walked away and said nothing to debrief. So that must have been one heck of a good feeling.
Yeah, it was. And, we did have a slightly small issue where he did ask me to see the PAPI at night, but we didn't discuss which one to look at. And he did ask me to view it again, but then we discussed which one to look at. And then he was all fine with that. But once again, that is not a component of the night flying. However, he just asked me and I complied with it. I didn't have a problem with it. But yeah, it was fine. Once you got airborne, the big thing is the PAPI obviously in the day. Once that was over and done with, that was probably the biggest relief because the night component is quite basic. But I can't emphasize enough that if you're worried about this test, go do a practice flight. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing saying you can't do that. And yeah, most people will be encouraging about it. But yeah. If any question in the comments, I haven't seen it. Michael, just please.
Yeah, absolutely. We've not got a lot of questions in the. I mean, if anyone is online, please, any questions you've got for Luke, now's the perfect time to ask any questions about how it was to do the test. I think you've given us a really great debrief on what it was like.
Oh, I just add.
Oh, sorry. No, you add. Yeah, no, add in. Luke,
as I mentioned as well, Flight Training Adelaide, who look after the Conscript Pilot Academy in Toowoomba, they were very, very, very supportive about it. Their head of operations up there and the chief operating officer, they were very aware of my situation. And from day one, when they knew stuff went downhill, they were very, very accommodating to to get it sorted out and get an aircraft hired and do whatever, stay in accommodation there. They were very good. So if anyone's looking to go there, you're in good hands. And, they're very supportive of colour vision deficient pilots because they know that, the whole thing's a bit of a joke, to be honest. And they're all pilots themselves, all the management. So you'll be looked after in good hands up there.
Yeah, no, awesome. And thanks for everyone who's saying to pop questions into the chat as well. So Rich Smith asked, did you feel that the flying experience you had, obviously said you had a couple of 270 odd hours, if you felt that was a big help?
One thing I should have mentioned is answering this question as well. There's a part of the flight instructor handbook that does say if you do have experience, you can use more aviation terminology. But honestly, I don't think if you've got much experience, you don't need to freak out. This test isn't designed to be, commercial pilot license flying test. It's just basically going up there doing some very basic activity scene stuff. But I would not freak out at all. Once again, I'll emphasize there's nothing wrong with doing a practice flight beforehand. If that answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think along this question along a similar line as well. How do you find distinguishing airport beacons? Mal sometimes struggles to distinguish the green from white. I can
Yes.
say, fortunately, not fortunately, not part of the test. Well, Luke, maybe you talk to it as well.
Yeah, so it is part of the test, Michael. If you have a look, you have to identify an aerodrome beacon.
Just to clarify that, though, we don't actually have to identify the colour, though.
Oh, we don't.
No,
we don't. No.
Yeah.
So for me, it was the air. I could see it and easily the flash rate and the pulse rate of it. I knew exactly what it was. So that was one of my tests. But yeah.
Yeah. So with regard to the beacon, the examiner I had discussed that about me saying they're being phased out. We could actually see AOCVA's one, which is where military pilots learn how to fly helicopters in the army. So that's about 11 kilometers north of Toowoomba. My apologies, Wellcamp. I did point that out, but that's all you have to do. You just have to point it out and you'll see it's just a swinging light. That's probably the hardest thing to see because that's usually the oldest lamps in the world they use for that. And the green is it's disgusting. And so is the white. You don't even know which is white, which is green, to be honest. It's really bad. So don't freak out about the aerodrome beacon. One thing that I also pointed out, I could see some tower lights in the distance over Toowoomba somewhere. One of the things is to point out if you can see like things at night. I just said, listen in the distance, I can see once again a red beacon, but you don't have to announce a color. I could see a light in the distance, and that's fine. That's it. But don't freak out about the beacon too much. It's not really a big deal.
Yeah, awesome. John, while I've got you, questions has come in around choppers. So Nick's asked the question, have CASA made consideration for helicopter pilots who obviously do auto rotations and don't have flaps? So does this test work across for rotary as well as fixed wing?
The idea is that it should be able to be utilised. I mean, I'm obviously a fixed wing pilot myself. I'm not really familiar with rotary operations, but the idea of the test is it's meant to be a generic one that can be undertaken across both aircraft types. Probably what I'd suggest to Nick, if there's any specific concerns that he may have, feel free to either contact CASA directly or even send us an email at CVDPA. I'll put my email address in the chat afterwards if you like. Feel free to shoot me an email with a bit more information and we can follow it up for you if you like.
Perfect, thanks, John. And I know Arthur's joined us as well, so I might just add Arthur into our group. So for those online, Arthur is one of the founding director of CVDPA. Arthur, welcome to the chat this evening.
Good evening, everybody. Lovely event. I'm sorry I was late, but I had some medical appointments to keep this afternoon.
That's not a problem. Luke, while we've still got you, and I think this is an easy question for us all to answer. Raoul's asked, following a pass, is there now any restrictions at all on a medical? I've heard of no passengers at night until 100 PIC sort of restriction somewhere. So the answer to that is all gone. That was the proposal under the AOCVA regime that was proposed. So a successful completion of a third tier test, be it the CAD or the AOCVA practical test, pilots will have no colour vision related restrictions at all.
Yeah, none at all. And something I've just
Yeah.
thought of as well, if anyone's worried about obviously their future, because obviously most people do aim for the airlines with fixed wing, I believe the unions for Qantas and probably Virgin, I assume, but I definitely know the Qantas union have written letters of support to CASA in regards to this test coming out. So if you are deficient like I am and are shooting for the airlines, I believe there's nothing to worry about, and they're accepting of this test. Like as Michael said, you got a clean medical, so you're clean as they can come.
Yeah.
And
Just to.
Yeah. Sorry, John.
Sorry, you keep going.
No, you go.
No, all good. Just to follow up on the question that was raised about restrictions, I'm just going to point out here on the CASA website, they do have a flowchart available. I should mention we discovered yesterday that there was 1 or 2 errors in this, which we've advised CASA of, and they're in the process of getting that updated. So we should see this changed in the next few days, hopefully. But again, it just sort of gives you an idea of what the requirements are now. So we start off with the Ishihara test. So this line coming out to the left with the fail going directly down to the CAD, that shouldn't be there. That line's going to get deleted. So basically you do the Ishihara test. The second phase, if you fail that, you go down to the Farnsworth-Lantern test. If you pass, obviously, either of those tests, you get a completely unrestricted medical certificate. So the lines go down to the pass. If you fail the Farnsworth-Lantern test, then you've got the option of undertaking either the CAD test or the AOCVA. And if you pass either of those tests, again, you get a certificate with no restrictions. If ultimately, you go through that whole process and you fail the AOCVA, there is actually an option to go back and undertake the CAD test again. And if you if you fail the CAD test, obviously after having done that, then you get a certificate with some restrictions here. So the restrictions that CASA are currently putting on there are not valid for night operations, not valid for passenger operations unless with another flight crew member who is not CVD and does not comply with a particular ICAO convention. So that's only if you fail. If you pass any of those tests, all restrictions are removed. But again, there's a couple of errors in this chart, but it gives you an idea of what to expect.
I think one thing that I forgot to mention, I think hasn't been mentioned either, if you don't get through the first time on the actual flying assessment, you do have another shot. So not all is lost straight away. In America, you only get the one shot. So we're very fortunate if you do, unfortunately, not get through the first time, you do have a second shot, which if you do pass, you still get a clean medical. So if that's relaxing a few people right now.
Mm. True.
Yeah, and Luke as well. I think we've got one more question. If this is something you can talk about, I'm not sure. We've had a question from Malaran. How much did the AOCVA cost you? So just even if it's just a rough order of magnitude.
Yeah, no worries. I had a little bit of. Okay, so what I should say is, you're just paying for the flight hours, which how long you hire the aircraft for. But because I did it with a CASA flight examiner, I don't actually have to pay for an examination fee. But I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe if you did it with like a regular flying instructor who has got the rating to do this assessment, you'll need to pay a fee on top of that. So roughly I did 1.7 hours worth of flying. I don't exactly know how much I've been quoted for the aircraft, but going by today's standards, usually an aircraft hire is about $350. So you're looking at, 350 times 1.7 is going to be, what's that, about high 600s. So it's nothing crazy. If you go do a CAD test, that is quite hefty as well, to be honest. That costs about $500 for the consultant. That's a lot of money considering they're proving that as a practical test. So my advice, go straight to the flying test if you have to do it.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Luke. Yeah, I mean, I can give my example from NZ. I paid for the aircraft hire. It's about the same, 1.86 hours or something. And then I paid, because they broke it as a day test and a night test, as separate tests, I paid 2 test fees. So I was about $2,000 in the hole at the end. Fortunately, it was only 2,000 New Zealand, so I was slightly ahead of that, slightly less than $2,000 Aussie. But yeah, that's, I think for anyone asking, that's how it's broken down. It's the same as any other flight test. So you'll have an examiner fee plus the aircraft hire fees as well. And that will vary based on the number of hours you fly and how different examiners value their time. I think that's it. That's all we've got for questions so far. Clinton, I guess I'm like 40 minutes in. Oh, hang on. Luke has asked a really good question. If you complete the AOCVA, is that result something that is recognised for life, or is there an expiry of some sort? John, I might let you answer that one.
No, so that one's recognised for life. If you pass it, it's an unrestricted medical. Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. Nice, easy answer. No trick questions from me tonight yet. Yep.
Can I mention something else about the flight test? That's
Sure.
right, Michael.
No, of course.
I know some tests, flying tests, you could expect the unexpected, but there's nothing unexpected about this test. As John went through before, that flight instructor handbook will break down every single thing you do. And that was the same for me. So you shouldn't be worried. They're not going to ask you, can you work out the TAS at flight level 330 with Mach 0.82 Mach number? You're not going to get something like that. It's just very, very simple. So no need to worry for any surprises.
Yeah. Just a general comment. I've seen a couple of comments come through there, Michael, too, about just comparisons with this test versus the FAA version.
Yeah, John, as someone who's done the FAA version, over to you.
Yeah, so there is a couple of fairly significant differences. The biggest one, from my perspective, is that the FAA require you to name colours, whereas, as we've been emphasising tonight, the Australian version doesn't get you to do that. It's more about interpretation of things that you can see. Additionally, the FAA version has a control tower signal gun test as part of that, where they shine red, green and white lights at you. And again, you've got to name the colours of those and get 10 out of 10. And probably the other difference is that the FAA test is only done in the daytime, whereas the Australian version is the day and nighttime components. And aside from that, probably just from a logistical perspective, the Australian one, from what I can see, is going to be much easier for applicants to undertake. The FAA version is quite cumbersome before you're actually allowed to undertake it. You need to firstly fail the initial colour vision testing. Then you need to sit and wait probably about 7 or 8 weeks to receive a letter from the FAA authorising you to go and undertake their practical test. And only once you receive that letter, you can then phone up an examiner to arrange for it to be done. So all up, it's quite a lengthy process over in the US. So I think probably all things considered, the version we've got here in Australia is much better, and it's certainly much more closely aligned with the New Zealand test as well.
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks, John. I think that definitely covers off some of the questions and comments around the FAA test. And yeah, Laurent saying there as well, it took him 6 months by the time from go to one.
That's about right, yeah.
Yeah. Mal, to your question now, can any examiner details be shared to set up an appointment for the test? CASA still hasn't shared the details. John, I know you've been in recent communication with CASA about this.
Yeah, so I just actually had some correspondence today on that. So, yeah, as we know, Luke was the first person to undertake the test yesterday with CASA, and that test was just utilised from an internal perspective for them to do a final sort of quality check of the test and all the documentation that went along with it. Now that that's been done, the next couple of weeks they're going to apparently spend getting the examiners trained up. From what I believe, they've had about 11 expressions of interest from examiners who are interested in becoming assessors for it. And those guys are all people that have previously done the old AOCVA test. So the training package is basically ready to go as far as I know. It's just an online training module that examiners have to complete. So that should be hopefully done within the next few weeks. And then they'll be authorised to conduct the test. And I'd imagine at that point, CASA will share those details publicly on their website. if anyone's after or required to do the test urgently, I'd probably recommend what Luke's done, and that is get in touch with CASA, and you may actually be able to maybe get one of the CASA examiners to come and do the test in the meantime, if you're in a bit of a hurry for it.
Yeah, and that might be an option. I don't know if it's an option, but something for people who have maybe got course dates that they're pushing to get into, set up as well for those doing 142 flying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question, because I've been out of the loop for a while? John, you mentioned a day and night component. Could you explain what that is?
Yes, so Luke's kind of covered that all off tonight when he's described his experience of the test, but essentially the day component is, it includes a ground component that is looking at maps and charts, flight instruments and displays. You take off, go and identify an emergency landing field, and then you lead into the actual PAPI component, where the applicant's required to know that the changing PAPI signals over the course of 4 different runs. So that essentially ticks off the daytime component, and then the nighttime component, again, you just go for a short flight at nighttime, have to identify aeronautical lights at night, obstacle lights, airport environment, runway lights, taxiway lights, things like that. So that's it in a nutshell. So there's the 2 components.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome, thanks, John. So,
no worries.
I think we've spoken. Thanks for everyone for your questions as well, and Luke in particular. Thank you for your responses and sharing your experience with the AOCVA. I might just the title of tonight's session was the AOCVA is here, and clearly it is. Although it might just be taking a little bit longer to be here than we'd all have liked, but it's definitely now here. But the other part is the title was what's next. So we now have the AOCVA. As a genuine practical skills assessment for colour vision defective pilots to get a totally clean medical. But we've been here before, I guess. We've had challenges in the interim. So maybe John, Arthur, Clinton, if one of you might want to share your thoughts on what's next and what we all need to be doing to make sure we keep this privilege that we've got. Clinton, I see you've come off mute, so I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, and let me add my public congratulations to Luke and for giving a very interesting and informative explanation of what you went through. I for one, didn't realise that the candidates had the choice not to fly the aircraft. That is, they could just go along as a passenger and do the information identification and interpretation tasks. So that was a very important piece of information for me. I think, as Michael touched on then, I would be encouraging everyone out there to give as much information as they can to the CVDPA, join the CVDPA, ask questions of the CVDPA, because if there's one lesson that needs to be learned out of the last couple of years, we must remain ever vigilant, and we need CVDPA to remain strong and active, because all it took was a couple of people in places of influence to completely blow up what we thought was an enlightened approach to operational testing and medical certification. And so even though we're in a great place now, all of what we went through, almost all of what we went through for the last couple of years, was entirely unnecessary. There was OCV in place. It could have been tweaked. It could have been, as they said they were going to. So we need to keep an eye on what's going on, and also note that there are some strange aspects of, it's at least to me, strange aspects of what they've set up. We can bypass those practically, as Luke has said, forget the CAD and go to the AOCVA, provided you're confident and you've practiced a bit, because one of the strange aspects is that if you fail AOCVA, you can't go do the CAD. If you fail the CAD, you can go do AOCVA, which doesn't make sense to me. Another odd aspect of it is you have to have a medical certificate holder before you can do the AOCVA. So what they're doing is preventing people from actually demonstrating compliance with the standard until they've first applied for a medical certificate and presumably been labelled as CVD with all these restrictions before you can do the third tier test, which is a very odd way of interpreting what the rules say about demonstration of compliance. They're saying you're not allowed to do it. So there are aspects of this that indicate to me that there is still influence out there of the people who would have the AOCVA done away with. Now, I don't want to end on a negative note. We're in a very positive place, but what I'm saying is we all need to keep our ears out and eyes out and keep us in this positive space, because it can easily be blown up, and we need to stop that from happening, so that finally Arthur can rest knowing finally there is an enlightened evidence-based approach to this issue, rather than this, what I call the Patterson's curse of stuff that keeps growing, that we have to keep eradicating, that we need to get rid of finally. But I'll get off my soapbox now and hand over to Arthur for his thoughts.
Thanks, Clinton. Well, I agree entirely with what you're saying. I mean, I've been the longest-standing advocate for colour vision defective pilots, reaching almost a period of 50 years since 1976. And the ups and downs along the way have been mind-boggling, and I think I don't know where it came from, but I wasn't prepared to give up at any point in time. And we are here now, and I have to say, I'm very, very grateful. Until about 12 years ago, I felt that I was running this thing on my own and getting, rolling with the punches and getting up and having another go at it. But then the structure of the CVDPA started to form in a way that brought in some expertise from outside, namely in the name of John O'Brien, who was the most outstanding example of a severe colour vision defective pilot, forming for himself a career beyond reproach, a career beyond any safety concerns, that when John came in and took some of the load, and then later Clinton, the legal aspects that you've helped us navigate. But we should never rest on our laurels, because we've been in the position before where we thought, well, that's it, it's set in concrete, let's all go home and have a good party or whatever. And only to find that there are still people out there who hold the strong religious beliefs that colour vision is a safety hazard, or defective colour vision is a risk to the safety of air navigation. We have to be on our guard all the time for any hint of that. I note too that with what's developed in Australia now in the last couple of months, has stimulated a lot more activity overseas. And I see that the AOCVA is now also becoming very vocal and posting on their website. And I think that we can look forward to perhaps assisting them and seeing that they achieve a result similar to ours. Nothing's perfect, but this result is just fine for now. I mean, I still believe strongly that the whole question of defective colour vision is irrelevant to air safety navigation, or the safety of air navigation. But that's just a personal belief. And for the moment, we are in a position to build up the population of people with significant CVDPA in Australia and New Zealand, to demonstrate that by the numbers, the issue is not an issue at all. But that remains for further down the track. I thank you all for your contributions. Michael and Simon, you've been a great assistance in the last few months, and it's good to see all your involvements, and I look forward to continuing on in this project until forever.
You would get a laugh out of this, Arthur, if I understood Luke correctly, that while he was doing the PAPI component of the test, which is the PAPI being the be all and end all. First of all, at one end of the runway, there was too much sun on the PAPI, so they couldn't use it, and so they went to the other end of the runway, and there were PAPIs on each side which were indicating differently. There you go. There's an essential piece of safety equipment. It's just that it is the paradigm example of why this focus on the PAPI is just all arse about peak. Get rid of PAPI and do something to contribute to safety rather than beasting colour vision deficient pilots. Sorry, I got back on my soapbox.
No, that's fine.
Well, I will argue indefinitely that the PAPI system, any system which depends primarily on colour recognition and distinction for a precision approach guidance, is inherently faulty. It is inherently dangerous, irrespective of whether you've got colour vision defects or not. And that has been proven time and time again. And I've spoken to, I guess, hundreds, if not thousands, of professional pilots who will agree with that their experience of PAPI is far from satisfactory. It is not a good system. It is inherently dangerous. So to build a system of discrimination based on the PAPI is morally and scientifically wrong. End of sermon. God bless you all.
No, thanks, Arthur, and as always, great to get your insight from many, many years fighting this fight as well, and being in the position now where it's one of take it. And I see Rich Smith said keep his foot on the gas. Well, let's take that breather and then keep that foot on the gas. So a couple of questions have come in, and I think I'll just summarise this, and then if everyone's okay, we might wrap up right on time. A couple of questions are, how do I help? How do I get involved? And I think the best thing I can say here is that the collective is greater than the sum of the parts. So, and in my experience, an organisation such as CVDPA, bring them into your thought process. Reach out and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing the AOCVA. What can I do? Because the more we work together and collectively share our experience, the greater data set that we have of 20, 30, 100 pilots who start to go through this and we start to learn from, the stronger position we'll be in to be able to prosecute this. So, and continue to prosecute it and continue to fight for more change, because this is a great place, but it's, Arthur, to your point, the start again of something, and keen to keep the foot on the gas and keep it moving. So unless anyone's got anything else, and we're happy to end on that, otherwise we'll close it.
Can I just say something? A lot of family ask this question to me, John. If I hold an AOCVA or an unrestricted medical in general, but I'm colour vision deficient, can I fly to another country? So I think you might be able to answer that question the best.
Yes, yeah. So that was sort of part of the discussion we were having, in the last 6 or 12 months as part of this whole review. Was this test CASA or ICAO compliant? So the consensus now is that it is compliant with the ICAO annexes. So yes, you'll have completely clean medical certificate and you can fly internationally.
But that doesn't necessarily recognise, if I was to work for, say, Cathay out of Hong Kong, they wouldn't necessarily recognise AOCVA, would they?
Not necessarily. I mean, obviously every regulator is different. So if you go and get a license in the US, you have to go and do a US medical. And you'd have to undertake their version of the colour vision test. Same if you're in Hong Kong. That's not to say that they may or may not necessarily recognise the Australian tests. If you to provide documentation to show, this is the sort of thing that you're assessed on, then I guess that's up to that regulator as to whether they'd consider it and accept it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But no, I just want to say thank you for having me. And I think people should know that there is a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes, specifically how an involvement the CVDPA has been with CASA this year. It's not easy dealing with those guys sometimes, but no, it's been a very good outcome. So thank you for having me, and well done to John, especially.
No, thank you. And I probably just would emphasise as well, we do have a couple of really good contacts in CASA at the moment that are really supportive of us and what we're doing and where we've ended up. So I think let's sort of keep that momentum going forward. If people do have any issues over the next few months as you go and undertake these tests, maybe for the first time, as we've said tonight, keep us in the loop. If you have any questions prior to it, let us know. If you've got any feedback after the test, let us know as well, so that we can pass that feedback on to CASA. There is obviously going to be issues that'll need to get ironed out over the next few months as things crop up. And as part of the technical working group, I know CASA do want to reconvene that group in another few months' time, just to sort of do a post-implementation review and hopefully fix any issues that do arise. So, keep in contact with us, please.
Great, and perfect way to end. So, for the 16 people still remaining on the stream, thank you so much for bearing with us this evening, and to everyone else who's joined, and those watching it on playback at a later date. Thank you for your time, and good evening.
Thanks, everyone.